Good day. As I make this program, just a short time before I began making this program, a dispatch appeared on Reuters which quoted Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Hanna Maliar, as saying that Rabotino has finally been captured by the Ukrainian military. This is this village, 6 kilometers. Actually, I noticed that Reuters says it's 6 miles from Orekhov, south of Orekhov, a town which, of course, Ukraine has always controlled throughout this war, which the Ukrainians have been trying to capture since the beginning of June, where by some calculations they've committed up to 60,000 men at different times, obviously not simultaneously, to try to capture. Anyway, according to Reuters and indeed to Hanna Maliar, Rabotino finally has been fully captured by the Ukrainians, and Hanna Maliar has been speaking about further advances by the Ukrainian troops south of Rabotino, presumably towards the Surovikin line, which, however, from Reuters dispatch, she doesn't actually allude to. Now, within a very short time after Hanna Maliar's comments, responses started to appear on the Russian side of the internet. Various Russian media groups, Redovka, Military Chronicle, said that they'd contacted their sources amongst the soldiers, Russian soldiers, who were actually fighting in the area, and they flatly contradict Hanna Maliar's claim. They say that the situation in Rabotino remains the same as it has been now for several days or even weeks. The Ukrainians have entrenched themselves in the northern part of the village, the small village of 480 people before the war. The Russians continue to hold positions in the south of the village. The central part of the village remains a contested area. Fighting continues. The Ukrainians have failed to consolidate control of the village, and the implication is, given the preponderance of Russian artillery in the area, like as has happened with Pyatikhatki, Staromayorsk, Rajaynoye, all of these places, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians ever will, in fact, consolidate control of Rabotino, at least whilst this current offensive is underway. So we have two reports which flatly contradict each other. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I have absolutely no way myself of saying categorically who is telling the truth and who isn't. However, in the past, when Hanna Maliar has made various claims, I have to say that they have not always turned out to be entirely reliable. My own impression of Hanna Maliar is not that she is somebody who goes out to deceive. I think sometimes she doesn't get particularly reliable information. She's talked, for example, in the past about Ukraine retaining positions in Bakhmut, even after those positions have been captured by the Russians, verifiably so. She's spoken of advances in various places, including, by the way, in the Bakhmut area, as she has done again in her latest statement, which subsequently turned out to be wrong. So she's not a fully reliable commentator about the events that take place on the battlefronts. Now, having said that, it's also possible that this being a very fluid situation, that she's got more up-to-date information than these Russian commentators do, and it may very well also be that Russian soldiers on the front lines are reluctant to admit to the fact that Rabotino, this village which has been fought over for so long, has finally fallen under Ukrainian control. I'm going to keep an open mind about this one, but I will say this, based on what has happened in the past, for the moment, I lean more to the Russian side of interpretation of events, as opposed to the Ukrainian side. There have been cases when Ukraine has claimed capture of villages like Pyatikhatki, Staromayorsk, and other places like that, and it's turned out that those claims were simply wrong or premature, or that Ukrainian control of these villages was incomplete. And I suspect that the same is probably true about the situation in Rabotino. Anyway, to reiterate, I don't think this makes a huge amount of difference now. Who controls Rabotino? The important point about Rabotino is not that the Ukrainians might have captured it, it is that they spent 2.5 months in an effort to capture it, and that this has cost them large numbers of men, huge numbers of machines, and of course the major Russian fortified lines actually lie beyond it. In fact, I saw one report which said that Ukraine would need to capture 4 more villages before it was really in a position to attack the Surovikin line itself. I'm not really sure about that. I'm not sure which these villages are, but anyway, I have seen that report. And besides, if we're talking about other places like Tokmak, which is this town which Ukraine is trying to capture, or says it needs to capture, and which lies beyond the Surovikin line, well, that's a much bigger place, much more heavily fortified than Rabotino was. I would have thought that is beyond Ukraine's reach with the resources which it has at the present time. Anyway, that's my overall take on the situation. There have been these Ukrainian claims today about the capture of Rabotino. There have been similar claims in the past, by the way. I'm not sure that they are true. I lean to the Russian view that they are not, but if Rabotino has indeed been captured, it is not the seminal event that some people, especially in Britain, would like us to think. Anyway, that's the situation in the Rabotino area. Elsewhere, there's been significantly less news. The Russians say that Ukraine has tried to launch some kind of counterattacks in the Kupiansk area over the last couple of hours, taking advantage of a Russian reorganization and redeployment in the area. The Russians say that the advance has been repelled. Denis Pushilin has come forward and claimed that the Russians have made some more advances in the Avdiivka area. I'm sorry to say, but I've come to consider Pushilin as a narrator of events who is almost as unreliable as I judge Hannah Maliar to be. So when he says that there have been advances in the Avdiivka area, well, I would like further corroboration of this. It's clear that Avdiivka, Marinka, all of these places have now been taking secondary significance to the main fighting, which is taking place elsewhere on the southern front lines, where the Ukrainians are advancing, and on the Russian front lines, where the Russians have been advancing. And I should say that, of course, the Russians claim it's they who reported these Ukrainian counterattacks around the Kupiansk area. The Russians claim that all of these counterattacks have been repelled, and I have no reason to suppose that that is wrong. Anyway, that's the situation on the front lines. There was also another big Russian drone and missile strike across Ukraine yesterday, and there's been an interesting article about Ukraine's drone offensive against Russia in The Economist. And this claims that 35 to 40% of Ukraine's drones hit their targets, but it sort of admits that fewer of these drones are hitting their targets than had been true earlier in the war earlier during the drone offensive, and that the Russians are now gradually getting on top of Ukraine's drone problem. At least that's the way I read this rather intricate article in The Economist. I should say that I think that the Ukrainians definitely are overstating things here. There's quite a lot of information from the Russian side about what happens with these drones, much more information than the rather more sketchy accounts that you get from Ukraine about Russian missile and drone attacks. And of course, there have been no Ukrainian missile attacks on Russia that bear any resemblance to the kind of Russian missile attacks, cruise missile attacks, that the Russians have been launching against Ukraine. But anyway, there we go. The Russians do provide quite a lot of information about Ukrainian drone attacks, and overwhelmingly my impression is that these are pinprick attacks. I've discussed articles in The Guardian and the Daily Telegraph that, in terms of the attacks on Moscow, appear to admit as much. And if we're talking about some of the Ukrainian claims about particularly effective strikes, they may be true, but in some cases, like that strike which supposedly destroyed the Tupolev 22M3 aircraft, I'm no longer quite so sure. Anyway, there we go. So, drone attacks, missile strikes taking place on the part of each side. Now, there are some rather interesting developments on this side. Firstly, the Russians have been reporting for several days now a total cessation of Storm Shadow missile attacks on their positions. And this has been the case for about a week. The assumption that the Russians are making is that Ukraine has run through the stock of Storm Shadow cruise missiles that were supplied by Britain. Again, there's absolutely no way to verify whether this is actually the case or not. France did also supply some very similar Scout missiles. They're essentially the same as the Storm Shadow, but there are certain differences, the Storm Shadow being an Anglo-French project. Anyway, there's been these Scout missiles as well, but so far they've not appeared on the battlefronts. Now, I don't know how many Storm Shadow missiles Britain supplied to Ukraine. I'm not sure how many Storm Shadow missiles Britain had to start with. I gather there were several hundred. I've heard reports that Britain essentially transferred the greater part of its stockpile of these missiles to Ukraine. I don't think that Ukraine has launched hundreds of these missiles at the Russians. It could be that what has happened is that the Russians have been able to deplete the stockpiles of these missiles held by Ukraine through their attacks on Ukrainian ammunition dumps and such things. Anyway, that's the situation there. It does seem as if, regardless of what is happening to the Storm Shadow missiles, whether Ukraine has run through its stockpile, whether part of that stockpile has been destroyed by the Russians, or whether there's some other reason why Ukraine isn't using them, it does seem that the Russian air defences have been increasingly effective in shooting them down, and I suspect that with largely intact Storm Shadow missiles having fallen into Russian hands, the Russians are now able to get a better understanding of how these missiles work and of how they can be shot down. So anyway, that's what I would say about the Ukrainian side of the missile offensive. Now, there's been some talk about things that have been going on the Russian side. Firstly, there's no doubt at all that Russian drones, that the drones that the Russians have been launching at Ukraine, the Uranium-2 drones, and perhaps other drones as well, as part of this, the strategic side of their missile offensive. I'm not talking about the tactical drones like the Lancer, which the Russians have been using on the battlefronts. Anyway, there's no doubt that the Russians have become much more sophisticated in the way they operate these drones. They're able to move and change direction and do all sorts of things of that nature. It also seems to be the case that Russian missile strikes on Ukraine have become increasingly sophisticated. The Ukrainians have just said that Russia uses more decoys when it launches its missile strikes on Ukraine than was true earlier in the war. So existing Russian drones like the KH-101, which seems to form the greater part of the missile force that Russia has been deploying against Ukraine, supplemented, it should be said, with Kalibr missiles launched from the Black Sea by the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and occasional hypersonic Kinjal strikes launched from the north, from these MiG-31 fighter bombers that the Russians have deployed in various locations. Anyway, it does seem as if these missiles have also become more sophisticated in the way that they operate. They seem to change direction and course much more regularly. And by the way, in a fact a report which I overlooked, but which did take place a couple of days ago, there were reports of some kind of a missile strike on Kiev, on western Kiev, and of an enormous explosion being heard, audible right across Kiev. And there were further reports later, that the Russians had struck and destroyed another one of these famous decision-making centers. So more Russian missiles are becoming more sophisticated in the way that they operate. They're better able to maneuver around Ukrainian defenses, and of course the Ukrainian defenses have themselves become thinner as the war has persisted. So there is that aspect about the Russian missile offensive. But every so often we hear about more types of Russian cruise missiles being deployed on the battlefields. A couple of weeks ago, perhaps some months ago, I remember seeing a report that the Russians had deployed land-based KH-35 subsonic missiles, and this was supposed to be a major game changer in the war. These are basically anti-ship missiles. They, to some extent, resemble the American Harpoon missile. Anyway, the assumption was that the Russians would be able to launch these missiles from closer to Kiev, from land-based positions, that Ukraine would not be able to monitor the aircraft, the strategic bombers, the Tupolev 95s and the Tupolev 160s, which are the aircraft that launch these KH-101 missiles, which have been the major missiles used in Russia's offensives. And of course, the Ukrainians getting information about the Russian bombers taking off from their air bases from the United States, that gives them an hour, perhaps 2 hours, to prepare for the arrival of these Russian subsonic missiles from their launch points, some of which are over the Caspian Sea, so they have to travel significant distances before they reach their targets. Anyway, the suggestion was that forward deploying these KH-35 missiles. They might be significantly smaller than the KH-101s, but forward deploying them and launching them from the ground would provide the Russians with a more effective weapon that they could use specifically to target Kiev itself. Well, I remember that report from some months ago, and then, as so often happens, I heard nothing further. I don't know whether that deployment took place. I don't know whether the KH-35s have been used. Presumably they have not been. There's not been any explanation of why, in that case, they have not been. Perhaps there were technical problems. Perhaps that was never the plan. But anyway, that gives you an example of how sometimes reports can come through about weapons developments and deployments which really don't have the significance that some people say they do. But there has been now word about the deployment of a different Russian missile, and this is the KH-50. This is what looks like a smaller version, much smaller version of the KH-101. A missile that is launched from, it's a lighter, smaller missile. It's also stealthy. It's fast, subsonic. In some respects, it appears to resemble the Storm Shadow, the Anglo-French Storm Shadow, only it has a much longer range, maximum range of 1,500 kilometers. The Storm Shadow's range is around 300 to 500 kilometers, depending, as I understand it, on the particular type used and its launch point. So this is in some ways a more sophisticated, more advanced missile, and it was apparently under development in Russia, and then the development was halted, and then it was restarted some time ago. And there are some reports that it is now appearing on the battlefields. And of course the point is, presumably, that this missile can also be deployed by tactical aircraft. I'm not sure of its size. Some say Tupolev F-22 M3s, which are of course supersonic, but I doubt that they've been used in any supersonic capacity in this war. Some have even suggested that they could be carried by other aircraft like the Sukhoi 34s, which are of course tactical aircraft and more difficult for Ukraine to track. And again, the idea is that you launch the missiles from closer to Ukrainian territory, or indeed over Ukrainian territory. There's less warning for Ukraine. These missiles, these KH-50s, unlike the KH-35s, are stealthy and fast, though not supersonic, and they can get through their targets and they can do more damage. Anyway, we'll see. But anyway, it's clear that the missile wars on both sides, the missile and drone wars, are an evolving thing. I don't see any reports appearing any longer of the Russians running out of missiles. There were so many claims about that last winter. There's nothing to suggest that now. I don't think anybody in the West supposes that that is the case any longer. But the missile and drone wars go on. But to repeat again, Ukrainian attacks have so far been largely pinpricks. Russian attacks continue to be devastating and to take place all across Ukraine. So that is the overall situation in the military conflict as of this moment. It seems to me that if one looks at the picture overall, we have a relatively quiet period in the war. The Russians are reorganizing their forces, building up their forces in the north. That same Reuters dispatch, which I spoke about, which mentioned Hanna Malyar's claim that Rabotino has been captured by Ukraine, mentions the fact that the Russians are building up forces in the north, possibly for an offensive there. It said that the Russians have deployed many of their best troops to that particular area. who's to say? But anyway, major Russian deployments in the north, and everywhere else, Ukraine continuing to make attempts to get its offensive up and running, to launch attacks on the Russian front lines, claiming to have captured Rabotino, but Russian reports contradict that. And as I said, on these issues, I found the Russian reports, on balance, the more reliable. So, no significant change or progress on the front lines in any part of the battlefront over the last few days, but with a Russian build-up in the north and a gathering sense that the Ukrainian offensive is now in its last weeks, and that it is the Russians who are now preparing the big blow. And we will see what that amounts to. Before I leave that one topic, I would say that there are reports coming from Ukraine that the Russians are concentrating 110,000 men along the northern front lines with hundreds of tanks and artillery and all of those kind of things. We'll see whether that is true. But of course, if it is true, then revisiting briefly a discussion I touched on yesterday in my video, that would mean, if it is true, that Ukraine can't afford to ignore any Russian advance in the north. The British claim that the advance towards Kupiansk is some sort of diversion, a diversionary exercise by the Russians to get the Ukrainians to ease off on the southern front lines would in that case be obviously wrong. Just on that one topic, by the way, I saw that supposedly Western officials have been telling Ukraine to pay no attention to what's happening in the north, that the Russians are unlikely to want to capture the entirety of Kupiansk, that doing so would mean that the Russians would have to cross the Oskol River, that crossing the Oskol River would isolate Russian forces west of the Oskol River, just as Russian forces in the western part of Kherson region became isolated as a result of crossing the Dnieper, and the result is that the Russians are most unlikely to launch an offensive west of the Oskol River towards Izium and Balaklia and all of those places. Now, I have to just quickly say that, again, I'm not an expert in these matters, and I accept that the Oskol River could be an obstacle if it's contested. But the suggestion that it can impede a Russian advance further west if both banks of the Oskol River are under Russian control seems to me far-fetched, to say the least. There can be no comparison between the Oskol River, which is a small river, which can in places be waded. I've actually seen pictures of this, at least in the right weather conditions. A small, narrow river. It is in no conceivable way comparable to the Dnieper, which in the area of Kherson city is 1 kilometer wide. Those sorts of parallels are also, it seems to me, far-fetched, and I can just see Ukrainian officers listening to all of this and shaking their heads in disbelief. But anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this. Now, there has been a most interesting series of comments by Zelensky about the ongoing state of the conflict. And he has talked about how Ukraine may have to and be able to go on fighting for a long time and live amid hostilities like Israel, provided it minimises its losses. And he said this in an interview he gave to the Rada television channel. He said, "We're ready to go on fighting for a long time if we don't lose people. We need to minimize losses, like, for instance, Israel. It is possible to live like that." And there's also been claims by other Ukrainian officials, which have been repeated by Zelensky in this same broadcast, in the same interview, that Ukraine, its military industrial complex is now working at full capacity, that it has trebled its production of weapon systems in July. I don't know from what base, but again, this is what Zelensky said in that same interview. "I have launched several missile programs. We manufactured various missiles and continue to do so. I cannot tell you how many we manufacture, but this is a colossal amount." And he went on to say apparently that production of NATO-type artillery has been launched in Ukraine, and we also learned that the Ukraine's Minister for Strategic Industries, Alexander Kamyshin, has said that the capacity of Ukraine's defense sector has increased threefold in July. Now, I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to discussing the state of Ukraine's military-industrial complex. I think that these claims from Zelensky probably have little reality behind them. After all, even Zelensky himself went on to admit that Ukraine is once more in the business of begging the West for more weapon systems. But let's just take, and as I said, the suggestion that Ukraine in its present condition, with Russian missiles and drones attacking all across the country, is able to produce tens of thousands of 155mm shells, where the United States and the European Union are struggling to do so. That seems to me to be unreal. Undoubtedly, Ukraine is converting these old S-200 missiles into ground attack missiles. But as I said on previous programs, it's not having much success. But let's put aside these elements of puff in Zelensky's words, and let's take a step back and think what this means. Because what Zelensky is talking about is a long war in which, in effect, Ukraine is thrown back upon its own resources. Now, that is not consistent with an offensive supposedly underway, which was assumed just a few months ago to be heading towards dealing a knockout blow on the Russians. So it looks as if, even if he's not quite admitting the fact, that even Zelensky himself has now come to acknowledge that there is no realistic prospect of this offensive succeeding, that the Russians are not going to be knocked out, they're not going to be defeated. And in light of this, he seems to be talking about Ukraine having to entrench, having to minimize losses in ways that do seem to be inconsistent with it continuing with the offensive that it has been engaging in at the present time. So that's one comment that he's making there. It looks as if he's preparing to accept that the offensive itself is not going to succeed, and that Ukraine, before long, might have to fall back on the defensive itself. But in what he is saying, about Ukraine having to rely upon its own resources in the war and being able to do so, he appears to be preparing the ground for an admission that resources, further weapon supplies from the West, on the scale that we've seen in 2022 and in the first part of 2023, that those supplies are going to start to dwindle from this point onwards. And he seems to be trying to prepare the Ukrainian population for this, whilst giving them reassurances that Ukraine can continue the war, even despite the kind of extended Western military support, even without the extended Western military support that it has received up to now. And of course, all of this is also coming in conjunction with more reports that Ukraine is now preparing a major mobilization. So a few weeks ago, there were all those claims that Ukraine might be preparing to call up 1 million men or 3 million men. I said that this was completely unrealistic, that it wouldn't happen. But it does seem now as if Ukraine is preparing a mobilization in which the intention is to call up between 200 and 300,000 men, which is actually a very substantial number. Vladimir Putin last year, September of last year, called up 300,000 reservists in Russia to make up the numbers of the Russian military, and that was a huge increase in the Russian military in Ukraine, and it's, by the way, the single reason, more important reason for the failure up to now of the Ukrainian offensive than even the fortifications have been. It means that the Russians now have reserves and can defend every part of the front line with sufficient troops, which was not the case in the summer and autumn of last year. But anyway, 300,000 men was a big deal for Russia in 2022. There was lots of commentary about this. There were reports of hundreds of thousands of people fleeing the country to avoid the conscription. There's been admissions, by the way, starting to appear in the Western media that many of these men who fled have actually quietly returned, and lots of things of that nature. But anyway, the point is, it was a big deal for the Russians to call up 300,000 men. Ukraine is now planning apparently to call up between 200,000 and 300,000 men from a much smaller, far more heavily depleted manpower base at a time when its entire domestic economy is under immense stress, when Russian missiles and drones are hitting targets all across Ukraine. I have to say, this is going to be a major strain on Ukraine, on its society. Presumably, probably, Ukraine can carry out such a call-up, but I've seen, or at least I've seen a report from somebody who's seen film of the latest batch of reservists that have been called up to the Ukrainian military, and the comment made is that this picture, this film, makes sad viewing. It shows older men and very young men and even a few women amongst the people who've been called up. So what it is starting to look like is a situation where Ukraine is perhaps becoming faced with some of the problems that countries that find themselves in these catastrophic situations, but which seem unable to make peace, it's doing the same things that they did. And the inevitable comparison is with what happened in Germany in the last months of the Second World War. In order to keep the numbers up, German men of all sorts of ages began to be called up, teenagers still at school, together with older men, and many of them were eventually thrown into the battle, often with minimal training, and suffered appalling losses in the process, but were only able to delay the inevitable by a few months. And I have to say that some of these latest claims about, increases in production of weapons, Zelensky also spoke about the fact that despite these big increases in weapons, he was going to be making a further push in September to increase weapons supplies to Ukraine from the West, despite reports that the United States has warned Ukraine that it doesn't have the resources to supply more of these weapons. Anyway, Zelensky spoke about doing that as well. And of course, we've had other comments from other Ukrainian officials that Ukraine will receive and bring into combat its F-16 fighter jets in the spring, which, again, I think most people consider to be completely unrealistic. And Ukraine talks about the F-16s as a potential game changer, which I think no one in the West believes to be the case any longer, truly believes to be the case any longer. So all of this, it looks to me as if it's basically an attempt to keep morale up as Ukraine prepares for this mobilization. And it's no longer a mobilization, so far as I can see, intended to regain territory. It's a mobilization intended to prevent a military collapse, to hold things together, though I'm not sure to what end, because it's also clear that Ukraine has been deeply spooked by all of the rumours of negotiations, of the West embarking upon negotiations, the United States embarking upon negotiations with the Russians, about the talk of Ukraine being obliged to make territorial compromises in return for NATO entry, those sort of things. And in fact, the Ukrainian parliament is rushing through a law which is intended to prohibit any sort of negotiation taking place which does trade territory for peace. It's again doing what it has done in the past. It's trying to foreclose the option of substantive negotiations in ways that make it more likely that the war will continue to the point when the Ukrainian state, finally experiences a total collapse. It seems a remarkable situation that Ukraine has now found itself in. In the first weeks of the war, in February and March, it negotiated with the Russians, trying to find a way out. Now, when the situation is perhaps far more critical than it was then, and when Western support appears to be flagging, it's turning round and has decided that it's not going to negotiate at all. It's going to go on fighting until the end, even if that means calling up 300,000 men, and it's going to encourage itself with stories about renewed weapons supplies from the West and increased production of weapons of its own. Anyway, that does seem to be the position in which Ukraine is in. Now, on the question of weapon supplies, I've alluded to this article in previous videos, but there's been a long article in the National Interest. It appeared on the 25th of August by Zachary Yost and Matthew Bryant, and it says the time and logistics of working against Ukraine. If Ukraine is to hold a candle to Russia, the Western coalition must reindustrialize its military supply chains on a mass scale. Whether it has the capability or will to do so is far from certain. And then it goes into a long discussion about the fact that the West in recent years has allowed its military industrial base, its military supply chains to deplete, to degrade, that it assumed that the kind of war that is being fought in Ukraine would never happen again, and there are quotations to this effect. And we also see reports that the United States simply cannot produce enough shells to make up the difference, to make up the numbers that the United States would need in order to keep Ukraine supplied to the level that it needs. And there was a really quite interesting comments about shell use and shell production. It said that this article claims that the British Royal United Services Institute estimates that Russia fired 12 million shells, artillery shells, in 2022, and that it would discharge a further 7 million shells in 2023. I haven't seen these claims before, but that would suggest a much higher level of Russian shell use than even I had expected. It contrasts this with US production of shells, which it puts at 93,155 millimeter shells a year, and that was the estimate that the CSIS made in January, which suggests that the United States might not yet be achieving its production levels of 24,000 shells a month, which it has claimed. Anyway, I'm not sure what the exact numbers are. It says that 93,000 shells a year would be less than 10% of Russia's current production. It's not clear. Well, 240,000 shells a year. If the United States is able to increase production this year to 240,000 shells from 93,000, that would still be less than 10% of Russia's current production. And it assumes a Russian production rate of 2.5 million shells a year. I should say that, to my knowledge, that is within the low range of estimates. Nobody seems to know exactly how many shells Russia is producing, but I've seen figures ranging from 2.5 million all the way up to 6 million shells a year. Anyway, put all this aside, it does go on to say that the United States, the West, cannot realistically hope to match Russian production rates, and that the implication is both the West and Ukraine need to start being realistic about these facts. And the article in the National Interest concludes, while Western analysts have hoped for a decisive breakthrough in the recent Ukrainian counteroffensive, this has not been the pivotal battle they assumed it would be. The fighting in Ukraine may drag on for years with no clear end in sight. the Putin government appears to be preparing for another wave of conscription, which will only increase the Russian advantages on the battlefield. In the words of an Atlantic Council report, Putin is preparing for a long war. These realities are not lost on some former top US security officials, though they are negotiating with the Russians in opposition to the Biden administration. These are the people from the Council for Foreign Relations who are engaging in these Tier 1.5 talks in Moscow, just to say. And this article, the authors of this article, assume that these officials are trying to negotiate, and I've discussed these negotiations, and the fact that the proposals made to the Russians are going to be unacceptable to the Russians. Anyway, these officials are negotiating not only without the support of the Biden administration, but according to this article, in opposition to it. And then the article concludes, the logistical reality is not changing in favour of Ukraine, and there is doubt as to whether the West has the will to mobilise to the same extent as the Russians. Well, there's a straightforward answer to that. It doesn't. The idea of the United States converting to a war economy to assist Ukraine is unrealistic, and I don't think anybody believes it. And then the article concludes, because of this, time is on Moscow's side, and Western policymakers who hope that waiting will bring a more favourable settlement are in for a rude awakening. And the article also says that the final outcome of the Prigozhin affair is to actually strengthen the Putin government's authority within Russia, which is probably true also, by the way, so that expectations or hopes of regime change there, or of a political crisis there, have now been dispelled. So, what the implication of this article in National Interest is its implication is that negotiations must begin immediately, which is, of course, the point I've been making all along. Well, we'll see whether that happens. We see that Ukraine is resisting the idea. It's going for mobilization. It's talking up its own production of weapons. It's continuing to claim battlefield successes like Rabotino. We get increasingly the sense, I get increasingly the sense, that Ukraine is either hoping or preparing to go it alone, or that some Ukrainian leaders are now preparing the ground for a stab in the back narrative, that Ukraine was on the verge of winning, that it was pushing through the Russian lines, but that the pusillanimous West let it down in the end, and better a total collapse following such a stab in the back than some sort of shameful negotiation, which will be politically unacceptable to the leaders in Kiev. And I have to say that, unfortunately, there will be takers for this stab in the back myth, and probably some of them will be found in the West as well. So that's, it seems to me at least, what is coming. A implicit recognition, a tacit recognition from Ukraine that its offensive is not going to succeed. A gradual understanding that Western support is going to start to ebb, though no acceptance that there are the logistical and industrial constraints on the West set out in the national interest. An attempt to carry out some kind of levée en masse to buy time, and probably a sedulous construction over the next few months of a stab in the back myth. A stab in the back by the West, which will have difficult implications, by the way, for the West as well, and which will no doubt find some traction amongst people in the West also. Some people in the West also. Well, there is another reason, I suspect, why Western support is going to flag over and above and beyond the industrial and logistical constraints discussed in this national interest article, which, by the way, has now caught up with comments being made by Brian Beletic, Alex Vashinin, and yours truly, well, for well over a year now. But anyway, let's not dwell on that. I suspect that another factor that is going to work against Ukraine is the gathering political crisis in the United States. Now, 2024 is going to be an election year, and that would have been the case, the situation in any event. But it seems to me that the Biden administration has raised the stakes in this election to impossible levels through its most unwise decisions to pursue prosecutions of Donald Trump. Now, it's difficult to know how these prosecutions are going to turn out in the end. We did a long program about this on the Duran with Robert Barnes, Alex Christoforou and I, which you can find, in which we discussed and analysed some of the recent cases and found them lacking in legal substance, to put it mildly. But there is no doubt at all that launching these legal cases in this kind of a way has now created an unusually high sense of tension and intrigue over the election next year. And so far, these cases, politically speaking at least, have backfired. President Trump's funding levels, the funding of his campaign seems to be growing. His polling seems to be increasing. He is far ahead of all other Republican candidates. He looks incredibly strongly positioned to win the Republican nomination. None of the other Republican candidates who are standing for the nomination seem to me to be convincing rivals. So we have the likelihood next year of an election in which the president's administration is trying to bring a criminal prosecution against the person that the president himself is running against. And as I said, that is an unprecedented situation in American history and a very fraught one. But what is probably going to make the situation more fraught still is that it now looks as if we're seeing increasing legal moves being considered on the other side by the president's opponents, and perhaps more worryingly, with some voices from the legal establishment, the American legal establishment, joining in the demands for these legal moves to take effect. Specifically, it looks as if the decision of the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, to appoint David Weiss, special counsel, in the various investigations that have been taking place of the president's son, have acted as a major catalyst for the launching of an impeachment case by the Republicans in the House of Representatives. And I noticed that people like Jonathan Turley, who have up to now been wary about launching impeachment proceedings, are now coming out openly in support of this. And of course, Jonathan Turley is Professor of Constitutional Law at George Washington University. He is somebody who's advised in previous impeachments. I suspect that he's not the only lawyer of his stature who is now talking about impeachment. And one of his most recent blog pieces, Turley has disclosed that he has been in contact with various Republican Congress people and has until recently been urging them not to rush forward with an impeachment. He's been telling them that they need to prepare the ground for an impeachment very carefully, but he's now saying to them that now the point has been reached, following the appointment of David Weiss as special counsel, when an impeachment is unavoidable and has become essential. And the objection to the appointment of David Weiss as special counsel is that it has been carried out contrary to the rules. Special counsel is supposed to be appointed from outside the Justice Department. David Weiss is a member of the Justice Department, and there's a widespread perception across the political class and the legal establishment that David Weiss, who has been in charge of this investigation since 2018, has slow-walked it, perhaps, in fact, it's widely supposed, intentionally so. And the appointment of David Weiss as special counsel has been seen more as an attempt to continue the slow walking and, in effect, obstruction of the investigation, rather than an attempt to prosecute it properly. So, it is very likely indeed that in the autumn, when Congress convenes, steps will be taken in the House of Representatives to launch a impeachment investigation. Now, I'm going to suggest that this is going to be a very different impeachment investigation from the two recent ones that took place whilst Donald Trump was president, in the case of the second, in some respects after he ceased to be president. Those two investigations, those two impeachment investigations, happened at extraordinary speed. In this case, I suspect we're going to see an impeachment investigation that is going to be more like the Watergate investigation that dominated the media headlines in the United States in 1973, and which, by the way, I remember well. I suspect that the Republicans will include some Democrats, actual, real Democrats in the impeachment inquiry. They will call witnesses, and there are witnesses now. There's an accumulating, increasing number of witnesses who appear to be willing to come forward to provide information about things that are material to the impeachment investigation. There's the former Attorney General of Ukraine, Mr. Shokin. There's people who were former business associates of the president's son. There's probably all kinds of other people who can give evidence. There's also the information that has been found in the laptop. There are all kinds of clues that can presumably be followed up there. And besides, putting aside all of that, it seems to me that not only do the Republicans have a great deal of material to work with and work through, which will take time, but it is probably in their interests to carry out a full impeachment investigation. Because, as happened in 1973 with the Watergate investigation, the more information of that nature comes out, the more damaging it will be for the president over the course of the election campaign, and the more the president's efforts will be absorbed with trying to deal and to respond to the various inquiries that are made as a result of this impeachment investigation. And of course, potentially, as more and more information starts to come through, the more of that information can be used, possibly, to sway some Democrats. In 1973, 1974, during the Watergate investigation. What eventually caused the President Nixon, to resign was the fact that he lost support amongst members of his own party, the Republican Party, as the accumulation of evidence became overwhelming, and it became clear that even Republican senators were prepared to vote to impeach him. And the Democrats will try, to some extent at least, to achieve and engineer the same thing. So, we're going to have a situation next year where the United States is bogged down in legal battles being conducted against Donald Trump, who so far has successfully turned all of these legal challenges to his own advantage, and perhaps a much more serious and damaging impeachment investigation against the president, which is likely to sap his authority going forward. Now, I don't know to what extent people in Ukraine itself understand the effect of all of this. I don't know to what extent people in Europe do either. But I suspect that, putting aside all logistical, infrastructural, industrial issues, it's going to be increasingly difficult for the president to make his case, to focus single-mindedly on the war in Ukraine. So, there it is. If Ukraine does indeed decide to pursue this kamikaze approach, or certainly it seems to me that's what the national interest people seem to be saying it is, of trying to fight on by itself, on its own resources, with its own manpower, relying on its own industrial capacity, talking incessantly perhaps about a stab in the back when it is eventually defeated. Well, that may be a decision that some Ukrainian politicians are prepared to make. But other Ukrainian leaders, and I presume that there must be some, really do need to start thinking about the realities of the situation that their country is facing, whether this kind of sacrifice is really justified for their country and is in its interests, and whether, in fact, given the realities, negotiations with the Russians might not be the best way. And of course, in terms of the situation in Europe, the same applies. Whether Europe really is justified in pressing on with this war, in maintaining support for Ukraine in the way that it is, rather than looking for some way to come to terms. That also, it seems to me, is the big question that European policy makers need to start thinking about now. Whether they will or whether they won't is another matter. But again, it's not just the industrial and military realities where the stars are aligning against them. It is the political realities in the United States increasingly also. Well, that's where I end my program today. More from me soon. Look forward to you joining me again in future programs on this channel. Please remember that you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there. Our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.